The bridge of the Verilok was a symphony of cold efficiency and simmering unease. High strategist Kyle Varick stood at its heart, his tall, crystalline frame bathed in the muted amber glow of tactical displays. Through the viewport ahead, the dark expanse of space stretched infinite and silent, broken only by the unsettling presence of the TNS Aegis. It hung there, motionless, like a predator biding its time. The ship's surface, a strange amalgamation of matte black and faint cobalt patterns, seemed to ripple as if alive. Cale felt the faintest tremor in his secondary heart, though his expression remained carved from stone. The human vessel absorbed light, rendering the surrounding void a shade darker, as though it had claimed the stars themselves. Tactician Derek's segmented fingers clicked against his console, his gaze darting between readings. "High strategist," he began, his voice low and controlled. "The vessel's energy output is anomalous. Gravitational fluctuations around it are disrupting our scanners." Cale did not look at him. His four eyes, sharp and unblinking, were fixed on the alien ship. "Define anomalous, tactician." Derek hesitated, a rare lapse in his precise demeanor. "Unquantifiable. Their systems seem to operate outside conventional parameters. The vessel's mass shifts, but there is no detectable propulsion. It is as if—" He paused, searching for the right words. "As if the ship is anchored to space itself, bending it to its will." Kyle's mandibles twitched, a subtle gesture that conveyed both curiosity and unease. He turned to Derek, his gaze piercing. "Are you suggesting it is alive?" "No, strategist," Derek replied, his tone sharpening as he recalibrated his stance. "But whatever powers it is beyond our understanding." Cale allowed the words to hang in the air, their weight pressing against the bridge's charged atmosphere. Around him, officers moved with the deliberate efficiency of soldiers, trained to suppress fear, but he could sense the unease rippling through their collective consciousness. Communications Officer Varn broke the silence, his voice tighter than usual. "Strategist, the ship has emitted a low-frequency signal. It's repeating." Cale turned sharply toward him. "Source and content?" Varn's claws hovered over his console, his mandibles clicking softly. "Uncertain. The frequency appears to interact with our systems directly. It's not language, but it feels deliberate." "Play it," Cale ordered, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. The bridge filled with a low, resonant vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and reach directly into the chest. It was a sound both vast and intimate, like the groan of shifting tectonic plates mingled with the hum of distant stars. Officers stiffened as though the sound had gripped their bones and refused to let go. "It's not a transmission," Derek said after a moment, his voice calm but tinged with urgency. "It's a statement." Kyle stepped closer to the viewport, his crystalline exoskeleton refracting the amber light into faint rainbows across the floor. His gaze bore into the alien vessel as if his will alone could unravel its secrets. "A statement of what?" he asked quietly, though the question carried an edge sharp enough to cut. No one answered. The silence that followed was broken by the faint tremor of the Verilok's hull, as though the ship itself recoiled from the alien presence. Cale's mandibles tightened further. "Tactician, prepare a formation. I want this vessel encircled and analyzed from all vectors. Communications, broadcast a warning." "Yes, strategist," Varn said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He tapped at his console, his movements a fraction too deliberate. The tactical display updated, showing the Therax fleet maneuvering into position. Sleek, crystalline ships glided into a crescent around the TNS Aegis, their hulls shimmering like starlight. Each vessel exuded a presence of dominance honed over centuries of conquest. But here, against this unmoving shadow, they seemed like ornaments in the void. "Warning signal sent," Varn reported, his voice steady now. No response. Cale's gaze remained locked on the alien ship. His secondary heart thudded rhythmically, a soundless metronome against the growing tension. "They're testing us," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Seeing how we react." Derek shifted beside him, his claws clicking lightly against the edge of his console. "If that's the case, strategist, We should respond decisively. A calculated strike to disable their propulsion systems would— They're waiting for that, Cale interrupted, his tone clipped. He turned to face his tactician fully, his crystalline frame glinting with authority. A ship like this does not appear in contested space by accident. It's a message, Derek, and a trap. Before Derek could respond, the tactical display flickered. A ripple of distortion spread across the hologram, warping the fleet's formation. Officers scrambled to recalibrate their systems, their movements tense but controlled. Strategist, gravitational anomalies are intensifying, Derek said, his voice tight. Their ship is destabilizing our field harmonics. Cale's mandibles flared in irritation. How is that possible? They haven't moved. I don't know, Derek admitted, his claws flying over his controls. But the distortions are originating from the ship. They're interfering with our systems without engaging directly. Cale's mind raced, every calculation branching into uncertainty. This was not a skirmish. It was a confrontation against the unknown, the kind of unknown that had toppled empires and rewritten the rules of warfare. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in decades: doubt. Strategist, Varn called, his tone sharper now. We're receiving another signal. This one is directed. Cale turned slowly toward the communications officer, his gaze heavy with expectation. Directed at whom? Varn hesitated, his claws trembling slightly before steadying. At us. Specifically, the Vir Alok. Cale's crystalline features hardened, and he strode toward Varn's console, his presence a force that seemed to pull the bridge's attention with him. Open the channel. I want to see them. The holographic display shifted, flickering briefly before resolving into a dark screen. For a moment nothing appeared, but the faint outline of an interior shrouded in shadow. Then a figure stepped forward. The human captain stood in stark contrast to the alien bridge. His uniform was dark and minimalistic, lacking the ornate decorations that adorned Therax officers. His eyes, sharp, unyielding, seemed to pierce through the hologram, meeting Cale's gaze as though distance and technology meant nothing. High Strategist Cale Varick of the Therax Dominion, the human said, his voice even and deliberate. I am Captain Adrian Voss of the TNS Aegis. I believe you've been observing us. Kyle's mandibles twitched, his expression inscrutable. You've entered contested space uninvited, Captain Voss. Explain your presence. Voss tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unbroken. Observation is a two-way process, strategist. We wanted to see how your empire responds to an unfamiliar variable. Kyle's secondary heart thudded louder, though he kept his tone cold. And what have you observed? Voss's gaze darkened, and the faintest trace of a smirk crossed his lips. That the unknown makes you uneasy. The channel cut abruptly, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. Cale turned slowly back to the viewport, where the TNS Aegis remained, unmoved and implacable. Strategist? Derek ventured cautiously. Cale's mandibles clicked together sharply, a sound like breaking crystal. Prepare for engagement, he said, his voice low and steely. If they want to test us, we'll show them how Therax responds. Cale Varick's command resonated across the bridge, a chilling echo of authority. The Viralok shifted subtly under his feet as the fleet moved into formation, its crystalline hull glinting with the light of distant stars. Around him, officers operated their stations with disciplined precision, their claws tapping in rapid sequences, their mandibles tight with anticipation. Yet the silence that hung over the bridge was more than protocol. It was the weight of the unknown pressing down on them all. High Strategist, Derek said, his tone clipped but steady. The fleet is in position. Target acquisition is complete. Cale's eyes remained fixed on the TNS Aegis, still motionless in the void. It was unnatural, that stillness. A predator so perfectly at rest, it almost seemed part of the darkness itself. It didn't blink, didn't flinch, as if the entire Therax armada were an insect to be swatted aside. Status of their systems? Cale asked, his voice calm, calculated. Derek hesitated. Readings are inconsistent. Their shields appear inactive, yet the gravitational distortions surrounding their hull suggest otherwise. It's like looking at a mirage. There, but not there. Kyle nodded slightly, his mandibles twitching in thought. They want us to hesitate, he said, more to himself than to Derek. But hesitation is a luxury we cannot afford. Signal the fleet. Fire on my mark. Yes, strategist, Derek replied, his segmented claws dancing over his console. Kale took a measured step forward, his crystalline exoskeleton catching the ambient glow of tactical displays. His gaze bore into the alien ship, unflinching. Mark! The Therax fleet responded as one. Streams of energy erupted from their sleek ships, each blast a deadly ribbon of light slicing through the void. The projectiles converged on the TNS Aegis, their brilliance illuminating the surrounding darkness like the onset of a supernova. Officers on the Verilok leaned into their stations, their eyes reflecting the glow of their calculated assault. Then, something impossible happened. The space around the TNS Aegis rippled, a distortion that seemed to bend reality itself. The energy blast slowed, as though wading through an unseen current, before curving unnaturally and arcing away into the void. No explosion, no impact. The human ship remained untouched, its dark surface absorbing the light like a black hole devouring a star. "What in the void was that?" Varn blurted, his mandibles clicking with disbelief. Derek's claws flew over his console, recalibrating. "Strategist, their ship manipulated the gravitational field to deflect our attack. It's rewriting physics in real time." Kale's secondary heart thudded against his thorax, but his face betrayed nothing. "Rewriting physics," he repeated softly, the weight of the phrase settling into his mind like a stone dropped into deep water. And yet they remained still. Why? The bridge shuddered lightly, as if the ship itself recoiled from the Aegis's silent defiance. Kale's mandibles tightened as he addressed Derek. "Send a second volley, coordinated pattern. Focus on overwhelming their distortions." "Understood," Derek said, though a note of hesitation crept into his voice. The fleet adjusted, their weapon arrays humming with power as they synchronized their next assault. Kyle watched as the tactical display glowed with renewed aggression. The second volley launched, a barrage of energy beams and concentrated plasma that raced toward the Aegis. This time the attack was relentless, designed to test the limits of the human ship's defenses. But the Aegis reacted with surgical precision. A pulse of energy rippled outward from its hull, an invisible wave that moved with terrifying speed. The projectiles dissolved mid-flight, unraveling into harmless particles before they could reach their target. The void seemed to exhale, the eerie stillness of space reclaiming dominance. "Strategist, their countermeasures are instantaneous," Derek reported, his tone sharper now. "They're not just defending, they're neutralizing." Kale's claws curled into fists, his crystalline armor groaning faintly under the strain. He turned to Varn. "Hail them! I want to see their response." Varn hesitated but complied, his claws moving over the controls with practiced efficiency. The holographic display shifted, flickering momentarily before returning to the image of Captain Adrian Voss. The human's expression remained calm, unreadable, his dark eyes unwavering as they met Kale's gaze. "High Strategist Varric," Voss said evenly, his tone carrying a disarming blend of civility and authority. "Twice now, you've fired upon us. Twice we've rendered your efforts meaningless. Tell me, Strategist, how many more attempts will it take before you reconsider?" Kale's mandibles tightened, a subtle crack running along the edge of one. "You're testing us, Captain Voss. This is not a negotiation. State your purpose, or be destroyed." Voss tilted his head slightly, as though considering Kale's words. "Testing you? Perhaps. Or perhaps we are offering you a chance to retreat with dignity. The Therax Dominion prides itself on superiority, does it not? Yet here we are, and your superiority has failed you." The words struck with the force of a physical blow, though Kale refused to show it. His voice hardened. "You speak as though the outcome is already decided. Do not mistake an opening exchange for the conclusion of this engagement." Voss smiled faintly, the expression devoid of warmth. A curious choice of words, strategist. Engagement suggests reciprocity, but so far this has been a demonstration. The channel cut abruptly, leaving the bridge in tense silence. Cale's claws flexed involuntarily, a rare crack in his otherwise stoic demeanor. "Strategist," Derek said carefully, "what are your orders?" Cale's mandibles clicked as he turned back to the viewport, his gaze fixed on the Aegis. The ship's glowing cobalt veins pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of some ancient leviathan. Its presence was a challenge, a riddle wrapped in darkness. "Reconfigure our attack patterns," Kyle said, his voice steady, despite the turmoil beneath. "Use staggered trajectories to confuse their defenses. We will find a weakness." "And if we don't?" Derek asked, his tone respectful but pressing. Kyle's eyes narrowed, his crystalline features catching the faint light of distant stars. "Then we'll create one." The tactical display updated once more, the fleet shifting into a new formation. Cale could feel the tension radiating from his officers, their movements precise but weighted with doubt. This was no ordinary engagement. This was a confrontation with something that defied understanding. As the next assault prepared to launch, Cale allowed himself a moment of reflection. The Aegis was not merely a ship, it was a statement, a declaration of humanity's defiance. And for the first time in his long career, Cale found himself questioning whether his fleet's unbroken record of conquest would endure the day. The silence that followed was electric, charged with anticipation and the faint taste of inevitability. Cale's claws tightened around the edge of his console as he gave the order. "Fire." The silence following Cale Varric's command was heavy, charged with anticipation and the faint flicker of doubt. The Viralok's weapon arrays glowed faintly, their crystalline edges reflecting the tactical lights dancing across the bridge. Outside, the Therak's fleet bristled with precision, their staggered formations shifting like predators circling prey. Kyle watched as the display projected the fleet's renewed assault. Lines of radiant energy converged on the TNS Aegis, weaving a complex web of calculated destruction. The bridge crew moved with efficiency, their claws tapping controls, mandibles tight with focus. Yet beneath their calm exterior, unease festered, a silent recognition of the predator lurking in the dark. "Strategist, volleys are on approach," Tactician Derek reported, his segmented fingers flying over his console. "Gravitational flux readings are stabilizing, for now." Kyle gave a short nod, his gaze fixed on the projection. "And the ship?" Derek hesitated, his claws curling against the edge of his interface. "Still unmoving. Their reading is dormant, but the distortion patterns haven't abated." Cale's mandibles tightened, a faint crack echoing through the silence. "Dormant? Or simply waiting?" Before Derek could respond, the display shifted. The Aegis seemed to flicker as though its existence were momentarily blurred by the fabric of space itself. The first volley reached it, striking its surface with the brilliance of collapsing stars. For a fleeting moment, the bridge crew held their breath, their anticipation crackling in the charged air. But the light didn't scatter. It folded. Energy warped around the ship's hull, collapsing into itself before spiraling outward in slow, hypnotic waves. The projectiles, rendered inert, drifted aimlessly into the void. The Aegis remained untouched, its dark, cobalt-lined exterior absorbing the violence as if feeding on it. "Impossible," Varn whispered, his voice trembling. His claws hovered above his console, their slight tremor betraying the fear he refused to voice. "Strategist," Derek said, his tone sharper now, "this isn't defense. It's an absorption field. They're not just neutralizing, they're converting the energy." Cale turned toward him, his eyes narrowing. "Converting it into what?" Derek's hesitation was answer enough. The bridge lights flickered, a low vibration rippling through the ship. It wasn't mechanical. It felt deeper, resonating through their crystalline frames as if the Aegis itself had reached out to touch them. Cale's secondary heart thudded heavily, the rhythm too loud against the silence. "What's happening?" Cale demanded, his voice slicing through the growing tension. Derek's claws raced over his console, Their field's distortion has reached our systems. We're registering gravitational interference across the fleet. I don't understand how it's propagating. Kyle strode forward, his presence commanding the room's attention. His crystalline frame glinted under the erratic lights, a stark contrast to the shadows deepening across the bridge. Explain what we're dealing with, tactician. Now. Derek's mandibles clicked nervously as he spoke. Their ship's core, it's not conventional. It's manipulating local space-time. Every time we attack, it redirects the energy into these distortions. Strategist, they're rewriting the battlefield. Kale's gaze darkened, his claws tightening around the edge of his console. Rewriting, and we're playing into their hands. His voice lowered, each word deliberate, weighted. This is not a battle. It's an experiment. The realization sent a shiver through the bridge, though no one dared voice their thoughts. The Therax were conquerors, their doctrine rooted in overwhelming strength. Yet here their weapons were useless, their strategies unraveling, and their enemy remained silent, watching. "Hi, strategist," Varn interrupted, his tone urgent. "We're receiving a signal. Low frequency again, but adaptive. It's targeting individual ships." "Content?" Kale asked sharply. Varn's claws danced over his console. "Unclear. It's cycling through patterns. Binary. Harmonic resonance. It's as though—" Before he could finish, the holographic display shifted. One of the Therax ships, a mid-tier destroyer, shuddered violently on screen, its crystalline hull fractured, shards breaking apart as if torn by an invisible hand. The light within the ship dimmed, flickering like a dying ember. "Strategist," Derek said, his voice strained. "Their distortion field, it's weaponized." Kale's mandibles flared, his posture rigid as he addressed the bridge. "Hold formation, focus on stabilizing field harmonics. If they want to fracture us, we'll adapt." "Adapt how?" Varn asked, his voice breaking slightly under the strain. Kale's gaze snapped toward him, sharp and unyielding. "By thinking like them. They're manipulating space, so we give them less to manipulate. Redirect power to hull reinforcement. I want all ship mass signatures staggered. No static targets." Derek nodded, his claws moving with renewed purpose. "Understood. I'll recalibrate the fleet's formation." The holographic display shifted again, showing the fleet's adjustments. Ships began to move erratically, their trajectories weaving like fragmented constellations. Kale's strategy was risky, unorthodox, but it was their best chance to counter the Aegis's calculated precision. "Strategist," Varn said, his voice steadier now. "The signal's adapting again. This time it's directed." Kale's mandibles tightened. "Directed how?" Varn hesitated, his claws hovering over his console. "At us, the Vire Alok." Kale's secondary heart pounded, his crystalline frame radiating tension. "Patch it through!" The holographic display flickered, and for a moment the bridge fell into shadow. Then the image resolved. It wasn't Captain Voss this time. It was the Aegis itself. The ship's dark, cobalt-lined hull filled the screen, its veins pulsing faintly with an otherworldly rhythm. No voice followed, no demands or warnings. Instead, the pulsing patterns intensified, hypnotic in their precision. The bridge crew stared, their movements slowing as though caught in a trance. The air felt heavier, pressing against them like an unseen force. "Close the channel," Kale ordered, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Now!" Varn complied, his claws shaking as he severed the connection. The display returned to the fleet's formation, but the tension lingered, heavy and unspoken. Kale turned to Derek. "What was that?" Derek's claws raced over his console. "Their field's distortion has reached our systems. We're registering gravitational interference across the fleet. I don't understand how it's propagating." Kyle strode forward, his presence commanding the room's attention. His crystalline frame glinted under the erratic lights, a stark contrast to the shadows deepening across the bridge. "Explain what we're dealing with, tactician. Now." Derek's mandibles clicked nervously as he spoke. Their ship's core, it's not conventional. It's manipulating local space-time. Every time we attack, it redirects the energy into these distortions. Strategist, they're rewriting the battlefield. Kale's gaze darkened, his claws tightening around the edge of his console. Rewriting, and we're playing into their hands. His voice lowered, each word deliberate, weighted. This is not a battle. It's an experiment. The realization sent a shiver through the bridge, though no one dared voice their thoughts. The Therax were conquerors, their doctrine rooted in overwhelming strength. Yet here their weapons were useless, their strategies unraveling, and their enemy remained silent, watching. "Hi, strategist," Varn interrupted, his tone urgent. "We're receiving a signal. Low frequency again, but adaptive. It's targeting individual ships." "Content?" Kale asked sharply. Varn's claws danced over his console. "Unclear. It's cycling through patterns. Binary. Harmonic resonance. It's as though—" Before he could finish, the holographic display shifted. One of the Therax ships, a mid-tier destroyer, shuddered violently on screen, its crystalline hull fractured, shards breaking apart as if torn by an invisible hand. The light within the ship dimmed, flickering like a dying ember. "Strategist," Derek said, his voice strained. "Their distortion field, it's weaponized." Kale's mandibles flared, his posture rigid as he addressed the bridge. "Hold formation, focus on stabilizing field harmonics. If they want to fracture us, we'll adapt." "Adapt how?" Varn asked, his voice breaking slightly under the strain. Kale's gaze snapped toward him, sharp and unyielding. "By thinking like them. They're manipulating space, so we give them less to manipulate. Redirect power to hull reinforcement. I want all ship mass signatures staggered. No static targets." Derek nodded, his claws moving with renewed purpose. "Understood. I'll recalibrate the fleet's formation." The holographic display shifted again, showing the fleet's adjustments. Ships began to move erratically, their trajectories weaving like fragmented constellations. Kale's strategy was risky, unorthodox, but it was their best chance to counter the Aegis's calculated precision. "Strategist," Varn said, his voice steadier now. "The signal's adapting again. This time it's directed." Kale's mandibles tightened. "Directed how?" Varn hesitated, his claws hovering over his console. "At us, the Vire Alok." Kale's secondary heart pounded, his crystalline frame radiating tension. "Patch it through!" The holographic display flickered, and for a moment the bridge fell into shadow. Then the image resolved. It wasn't Captain Voss this time. It was the Aegis itself. The ship's dark, cobalt-lined hull filled the screen, its veins pulsing faintly with an otherworldly rhythm. No voice followed, no demands or warnings. Instead, the pulsing patterns intensified, hypnotic in their precision. The bridge crew stared, their movements slowing as though caught in a trance. The air felt heavier, pressing against them like an unseen force. "Close the channel," Kale ordered, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Now!" Varn complied, his claws shaking as he severed the connection. The display returned to the fleet's formation, but the tension lingered, heavy and unspoken. Kale turned to Derek. "What was that?" "Direct hit on their aft section," Varn called out, his claws gripping the edges of his console. "Their distortion field is collapsing in that quadrant." Kyle seized the moment. "Target the breach. Concentrate all firepower. Make it decisive." The fleet responded with ruthless efficiency. Energy beams tore through the void, striking the exposed section of the Aegis with devastating force. The human ship reeled, its once pristine surface marred by deep fractures that glowed with molten intensity. Shards of its hull splintered into the darkness, each fragment spinning like dying embers. The bridge erupted in a murmur of restrained triumph, officers exchanging brief glances of relief. But Kale did not celebrate. His gaze remained fixed on the tactical display, his mind turning over every possibility, every variable. "They're baiting us," Kale said abruptly, his voice cutting through the muted buzz of activity. The bridge fell silent, all eyes turning to the strategist. Derek tilted his head, his claws pausing mid-motion. "Strategist?" Kale gestured to the projection, his tone colder now. "Their movements, their defense. It's too deliberate, too restrained. They're leading us to a conclusion they want us to reach. Are you suggesting they're feigning weakness? Derek asked, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. Cale's gaze hardened. I'm suggesting they're far more patient than we anticipated. Maintain the attack, but recalibrate our focus. Test their response. Derek complied, issuing a series of rapid commands. The fleet adjusted, shifting their firepower to new vectors designed to probe the Aegis's defenses. The human ship reacted with precision, its countermeasures reactivating in calculated bursts. Strategist, Varn said, his tone laced with caution, their systems are realigning. The bridge shuddered violently, throwing several officers off balance. Kyle gripped the console, his claws digging into its surface as he steadied himself. The holographic display flickered, its projections distorting under the sudden disruption. "Report!" Kyle barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Derek's claws moved frantically, his expression grim. Gravitational wave detected, originating from their ship. It's massive. They're retaliating. The tactical display updated, revealing a surge of energy radiating from the Aegis. The wave expanded rapidly, its edges shimmering like heat rising from scorched metal. It swept through the fleet with unrelenting force, bending light and space in its wake. Ships shuddered under the wave's impact, their crystalline hulls groaning as the distortions tore at their structure. One destroyer fractured completely, its shards scattering into the void like the remains of a shattered star. "Shields holding at 70%, Varn called, his voice strained, but sustained exposure will compromise integrity. Cale's mandibles tightened, his mind racing. The Aegis had shown its teeth, but the wave was not merely an act of aggression, it was a demonstration of capability, a warning. "They're forcing us into retreat," Derek said, his tone low but steady. "If we pull back now, they'll consolidate their advantage." Cale's gaze remained locked on the Aegis, his thoughts a storm of calculations and possibilities. "We're not retreating," he said, his voice a blade of resolve. "Redirect all remaining drones. Focus their interference patterns on the wave's origin point. Break their momentum." "Understood," Derek replied, his claws flying over the controls. The drones moved in synchronized unison, their pulses converging on the Aegis. The human ship shuddered, its gravitational wave faltering under the concentrated assault. The fleet regained its footing, their formations tightening as the tide began to turn. Cale's secondary heart pounded steadily as he issued his next command. "Prepare a secondary barrage. Target their weakened sections. If they want to teach us, we'll show them we're willing to learn." The fleet obeyed, their energy beams slicing through the void with renewed precision. The Aegis absorbed the assault, but its movements were slower now, its countermeasures less effective. For the first time, Cale felt the faintest spark of hope, a fragile ember against the encroaching darkness. But the ember did not bring comfort. The Aegis was wounded, yes, but it was not defeated. And as Cale stared into the abyss of its unyielding form, he could not shake the feeling that the human ship was merely waiting, biding its time for a strike that would redefine the battlefield once more. The air on the Verilox bridge seemed heavier now, an invisible weight pressing down on its officers. High strategist Cale Varick stood at the tactical console, his crystalline exoskeleton refracting the soft glow of holographic displays. His four eyes were fixed on the TNS Aegis, the human ship that remained defiant against every calculated strike. "Strategist," tactician Derek began, his segmented fingers moving deftly over his controls. "The gravitational distortions around their ship have intensified. Our interference drones are holding for now, but the readings are unusual." Cale turned his head slightly, his gaze sharp. "Define unusual?" Derek hesitated, his mandibles clicking softly in contemplation. "The distortions aren't just defensive, they're radiating outward in deliberate patterns. It's as though their ship is recalibrating the battlefield itself." Cale's jaw tightened, a faint crack echoing through the bridge. "A deliberate strategy," he murmured. "They're not just defending, they're dictating the terms of engagement." The Aegis loomed on the display, its cobalt veins pulsing with an erratic rhythm that felt almost alive. Kyle's eyes narrowed, studying the patterns with the precision of a predator stalking prey. It was a ship of contradictions, motionless yet dynamic, silent yet deafening in its defiance. "Varn," Kyle said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Status of the fleet?" Communications Officer Varn glanced up from his station, his mandibles twitching. "Shields are holding at 60%, strategist. 2 destroyers are severely compromised, but their crews are maintaining position." Kale gave a curt nod. "And their morale?" Varn hesitated, his claws hovering over his console. "Tense, but steady. They trust your leadership." Kale's mandibles twitched, a faint glimmer of satisfaction flashing through his otherwise unreadable expression. Trust was a currency he wielded sparingly, but effectively. "Good. Keep them focused. The moment doubt creeps in, we lose." Before Varn could respond, the tactical display flickered, a ripple of distortion spreading across its surface. The hologram wavered, its projections bending unnaturally as though struggling against an unseen force. "Report!" Kale barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Derek's claws moved with frantic precision, his eyes darting across the chaotic data. "Their ship, strategist, their core output has spiked dramatically. It's emitting— I don't know how to describe it. It's not energy, it's information." Kale's mandibles clicked together, the sound like the snapping of brittle stone. "Explain." Derek gestured to the display, the distorted patterns coalescing into a mesmerizing array of spirals and arcs. "This isn't random. These are deliberate transmissions, highly compressed data bursts. They're broadcasting directly into the fabric of space." Kale's gaze darkened. "To what end?" Derek hesitated, his mandibles tightening. "Strategist, it's possible they're attempting to disrupt more than our systems. If this is information, it could be targeting our thought patterns, our decision-making." The bridge fell silent, the weight of Derek's words settling like a suffocating fog. Kale's secondary heart thudded heavily, its rhythm steady but deliberate. He stepped closer to the display, his crystalline frame catching the erratic light. "Varn," he said quietly, his voice like steel tempered in flame, "is their signal directed at us specifically?" Varn nodded, his claws trembling slightly. "Yes, strategist. The signal is focused on the Vir Alok." Kale's mandibles tightened further, his mind racing. The Aegis wasn't simply observing. They were probing, testing the limits of Therak's understanding. But for what purpose? What could they hope to gain? "Open the channel," Kale ordered, his voice firm, despite the tension crackling through the bridge. "Let's hear what they have to say." Varn hesitated but complied, his claws moving with measured precision. The holographic display flickered again, the distorted patterns giving way to the image of Captain Adrian Voss. The human's expression was calm, his dark eyes steady and unyielding. "High Strategist Kale Varric," Voss began, his tone even and deliberate. "You've proven your fleet's capabilities. Now, let's see if you can match that with understanding." Kale's mandibles twitched, his crystalline features reflecting the faint glow of the projection. "Understanding," he repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. "You speak as though we're equals, Captain." Voss's lips curved into a faint smile, devoid of mockery. "In some ways we're not, but in others perhaps we are. What matters now is whether you're willing to listen." Kale's secondary heart thudded louder, the rhythm echoing through his frame. "You misunderstand the nature of this engagement. We are not here to listen. We are here to ensure the dominance of the Therak's dominion." Voss's smile faded, his expression hardening. "Dominance is fleeting, strategist. Adaptation endures. You've seen what the Aegis is capable of, but this ship is not our weapon, it's our voice. And we've been speaking to you this entire time." Kale's gaze sharpened, his mind racing to decipher the human's words. "Your voice?" he asked, his tone edged with suspicion. "You've done nothing but provoke us." "Provocation," Voss replied, "is a necessary catalyst for revelation. You're fighting us with strength, but strength is not the foundation of power. Knowledge is. And that's what we've been offering you." The channel cut abruptly, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. Cale turned to Derek, his mandibles flaring. What did they mean? What knowledge? Derek's claws moved frantically, his eyes scanning the chaotic data. Strategist, the data bursts. They're transmitting more than interference. These patterns. They're blueprints for gravitational manipulation, for systems far beyond our comprehension. Kyle's crystalline features darkened, his thoughts a storm of calculations and possibilities. The Aegis wasn't just a ship, it was a message, a declaration of human ingenuity. But was it a gift, or a weapon disguised as one? Strategist, Varn said cautiously, his voice breaking the tension. What are your orders? Cale's gaze remained fixed on the tactical display, his mind racing. The human ship had revealed its hand, but the game was far from over. He turned slowly to his officers, his voice cold and deliberate. We prepare for their next move, he said. And this time, we strike not with force, but with precision. If they want us to learn, then we'll learn how to dismantle them. The bridge buzzed with renewed focus, the officers moving with purpose. But as Cale stared into the abyss of the Aegis, he couldn't shake the feeling that the humans were still one step ahead, a feeling that tightened its grip with every passing moment. Kyle Varick's crystalline exoskeleton shimmered faintly under the shifting lights of the Veralox bridge, the patterns reflecting the storm of calculations raging in his mind. The revelation from Captain Voss echoed in the silence, each word carrying a weight that pressed down on the crew like the crushing depths of an ocean. Blueprints, Cale repeated, his voice a sharp blade cutting through the tension. They're handing us a weapon or an ultimatum. Which, Derek? Tactician Derek didn't look up from his console, his segmented claws darting with desperate precision. The data doesn't align with a conventional strategy, strategist. It's too open, too accessible. If this is a weapon, it's the most reckless delivery I've ever seen. Cale narrowed his eyes at the pulsing cobalt veins of the TNS Aegis displayed before him. It loomed in space like a riddle carved from the void itself, its eerie patterns defying logic. And yet they've outmaneuvered us at every turn, Cale said quietly. This openness, this gesture, might be the final piece of their strategy. Strategist, Varn interjected, his claws trembling faintly over his station. If this is genuine, if they're offering their advancements freely, it could shift the balance of power. It could redefine everything. Redefine, Cale said, the word sharp and disdainful. You speak as though we've already surrendered, communications officer. The Therax Dominion does not bend to riddles. The bridge was silent, save for the subtle flicker of projections, casting ghostly patterns across the crystalline walls. The officers worked in tense synchronization, their movements betraying the burden of uncertainty weighing on their minds. Strategist, Derek said, breaking the silence. The data's structure. It's rewriting itself in response to our systems. This isn't static information, it's evolving. Cale's secondary heart thudded steadily, a drumbeat of defiance. They're forcing us to adapt, he said, his mandibles twitching, to engage with them on their terms. Derek's mandibles clicked as he studied the streams of data. Then the question becomes, do we play their game, or do we end it? Cale's crystalline frame seemed to harden, his posture straightening with cold resolve. We find the balance, analyze the patterns, use what you can to disrupt their field harmonics. Yes, strategist, Derek said, his voice steady despite the storm of uncertainty surrounding him. Cale turned to Varn. And their ship? Any signs of movement? Varn shook his head, his mandibles tightening. None, strategist. They remain stationary, but the gravitational distortions around them are growing in intensity. Cale's gaze returned to the tactical display. The Aegis was a paradox, its stillness concealing a storm of activity beneath its surface. It was like staring into the eye of a hurricane, knowing the devastation that surrounded it. Prepare the fleet, Cale ordered, his tone colder now. Staggered formation. We test their defenses, but we do not commit. Not yet. Derek's claws moved with practiced precision, issuing commands that rippled through the fleet. The tactical display updated, showing the Therax ships adjusting their positions, their crystalline hulls glinting faintly as they maneuvered into the new formation. The first volley was fired, a calculated, probing strike aimed at the weakest points of the Aegis's defenses. The energy beams streaked through the void, their brilliance illuminating the dark expanse of space. For a moment it seemed the human ship might falter. The distortions around its hull wavered, the cobalt veins dimming under the pressure. Then came the countermeasure. A wave of gravitational energy erupted from the Aegis, rippling outward with terrifying speed. The Therax ships shuddered under the impact, their formations scattering as the wave tore through their ranks. Several smaller vessels fractured, their crystalline hulls splintering into shards that drifted into the void like dying stars. "Strategist!" Varn called out, his voice edged with panic. "They've destabilized our formation. We're losing cohesion." Kyle's mandibles clicked sharply, his gaze never leaving the display. "Reinforce the perimeter. Redirect power to structural integrity. We regroup and strike again." The officers moved with frantic determination, their movements a flurry of precise gestures. Kyle's mind raced, calculating the next move. The Aegis was adapting too quickly, its responses growing sharper with every encounter. It was as though the ship itself were learning, evolving in real time. "Strategist," Derek said, his tone tight with urgency, "we need to consider withdrawal. If we can't counter their distortions..." "Withdrawal is not an option," Kale snapped, his voice cutting through Derek's protest. "Not while they hold the advantage. We fight until we take it from them." Derek hesitated but nodded, his claws resuming their frantic work. The tactical display shifted, showing the fleet's renewed efforts to regroup. The Viralock stood at the center, its presence a rallying point for the scattered ships. Kyle turned his gaze back to the Aegis, his mandibles tightening. The ship's cobalt veins pulsed steadily now, their rhythm hypnotic and unnerving. It was as though the ship were taunting them, daring them to try again. "Hi, strategist," Varn said, his voice trembling. "The human ship is transmitting another signal, directed at us." Kale's eyes narrowed. "Patch it through." The holographic display flickered, and once again, Captain Voss appeared. His expression was calm, but there was a weight to his gaze, a quiet confidence that set Kale's secondary heart pounding. "Hi, Strategist Varric," Voss began, his tone deliberate. "You've shown remarkable tenacity. But tell me, how much are you willing to lose to maintain your pride?" Kyle's mandibles twitched, his crystalline features hardening. "You speak of pride, Captain, as though it's a weakness. But you fail to understand. Pride is the foundation of dominance." Voss's lips curved into a faint smile. "Dominance," he said softly, "an illusion that crumbles when faced with inevitability. Tell me, strategist, what will you do when dominance is no longer an option?" Kale's eyes burned with defiance. "We adapt. We survive. We overcome." Voss's expression grew somber, his gaze steady. "Then you understand more than you realize. And perhaps in time you'll see that survival isn't about dominance. It's about balance." The channel cut abruptly, leaving the bridge in silence. Kale turned to his officers, his voice cold and commanding. "We strike again. Adjust the formation. Adapt to their patterns. If they want balance, we'll show them the weight of our resolve." The fleet moved once more, their precision sharpened by desperation. But as the Aegis loomed on the tactical display, its cobalt veins pulsing like the heartbeat of something ancient and unknowable, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that the human ship was still one step ahead. Kale Varric stood motionless at the center of the Viralock's bridge, his towering crystalline frame cast in the cold glow of flickering tactical displays. The air was thick with tension, every officer bristling under the weight of their shared failure to counter the TNS Aegis. The alien ship still dominated the projection, its pulsing cobalt veins defying logic, its stillness mocking their might. Kale's mind raced, a storm of strategies clashing against the stark reality of their disadvantage. They had tried brute force and precision strikes, yet the human ship adapted with a speed that defied Therax doctrine. The battlefield had shifted in ways Kale had never seen before, and now survival depended not on dominance, but ingenuity. Tactician Derek, Cale said, his voice steady and sharp, summarize our failures. Quickly. Derek's claws darted over his console, the faint tapping echoing in the tense silence. Strategist, every engagement has been neutralized through gravitational distortion. Their core absorbs or redirects energy faster than our systems can respond. Our formations have been scattered twice, and our countermeasures delayed by interference. Cale nodded, his mandibles clicking softly in thought. And their weakness? Derek hesitated, his segmented fingers pausing mid-motion. Strategist, their weakness isn't structural, it's temporal. Cale turned sharply, his crystalline features catching the fragmented light of the tactical display. Explain. Derek gestured to the hologram, where the Aegis's pulsing energy patterns were displayed in hypnotic loops. Their core adapts rapidly, but the distortion field takes microseconds to recalibrate during sustained attacks. It's minuscule, but during that window, their systems are vulnerable to cumulative interference. Cale's secondary heart thudded against his thorax, his mind seizing on the possibility. A vulnerability, no matter how brief, is an opening. Can we exploit it? Derek's mandibles twitched. If we can synchronize our attacks precisely, hitting their systems repeatedly during recalibration, it might overwhelm their field. But we'd need flawless timing and absolute coordination across the fleet. Cale's gaze hardened, his crystalline frame radiating determination. Then we'll achieve it. Prepare the fleet for synchronized engagement. I want every ship armed with gravimetric disruptors and staggered plasma barrages. Strategist, Varn interjected cautiously, his claws hovering over his communication panel. If this fails, the fleet will be left exposed. Their countermeasures could annihilate us. Cale's eyes locked onto Varn, his tone cold and unyielding. And if we do nothing, we lose. This is not a debate, communications officer. Execute the order. Varn bowed his head slightly, his mandibles tightening as he relayed the command. Across the bridge, officers moved with renewed urgency, their claws darting over controls as the fleet adjusted its formation. The tension was palpable, a sharp undercurrent that coursed through every movement, every breath. Kyle stepped closer to the viewport, his eyes narrowing as he studied the Aegis. It hung there like a dark omen, its cobalt veins pulsating with an alien rhythm. The ship was more than a weapon. It was a declaration, a challenge to everything the Therax Dominion had built its empire upon. And Cale would not let it stand unchallenged. Derek, Cale said, his voice low but commanding. How long to synchronize the fleet? 3 minutes, strategist, Derek replied, his tone clipped. I've programmed each ship's disruptor to emit staggered pulses. If we can maintain cohesion, we'll hit them during their recalibration window. Cale nodded, his secondary heart thudding steadily. Then we proceed. Begin the countdown. The tactical display updated, showing the fleet moving into position. The ships glided through the void with calculated precision, their crystalline hulls glinting faintly under the distant starlight. Each vessel carried the weight of Cale's strategy, their movements a reflection of his calculated resolve. The first volley launched, a series of gravimetric disruptor pulses that rippled through space like the echoes of a distant storm. The pulses converged on the Aegis, their impact distorting the human ship's field in erratic waves. The cobalt veins flickered, their rhythm faltering under the sustained assault. Field destabilizing, Derek reported, his voice edged with tension. Their recalibration window is narrowing, preparing plasma barrage. Cale's mandibles twitched, his focus unbroken. Execute. Do not let them recover. The second wave followed, a barrage of plasma bolts that streaked through the void with blinding intensity. The Aegis shuddered under the impact, its hull glowing faintly as the plasma dissipated against its defenses. For the first time, the ship's movements were erratic, its distortions unable to fully counter the assault. Direct hit on their core structure, Varn called out, his tone carrying a flicker of hope. Their systems are faltering. Cale allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before turning to Derek. Continue the assault. Overwhelm their recalibration. If they falter, we strike harder. The fleet obeyed with ruthless efficiency, their synchronized attacks hammering the Aegis with unrelenting force. The human ship reeled, its once impenetrable defense showing cracks as the distortion field flickered and dimmed. For a fleeting moment, victory seemed within reach. Then came the retaliation. A surge of gravitational energy erupted from the Aegis, rippling outward with devastating speed. The fleet shuddered under the impact, several smaller ships fracturing under the strain. The Viralock groaned as the wave passed through it, its crystalline hull trembling but holding firm. "Strategist!" Derek called out, his voice sharp. "They've activated a secondary system. Gravitational anomalies are destabilizing our formation." Cale's mandibles tightened, his mind racing. The Aegis had adapted again, its countermeasure designed to scatter the fleet and disrupt their synchronization, but Cale was not ready to concede. "Redirect all disruptor pulses to their core," Cale barked, his voice a blade of command. "We force them into recalibration again. Their systems cannot sustain this indefinitely." Derek's claws flew over his console, issuing rapid commands. The fleet adjusted, their attacks converging on the Aegis's core with renewed precision. The human ship shuddered under the assault, its cobalt veins pulsing erratically as the distortions intensified. Kyle stepped closer to the tactical display, his crystalline frame catching the flickering light. The battlefield was a chaos of energy and movement, the Aegis at its center like a dark star consuming everything around it. And yet, despite the destruction, Cale saw an opportunity. "Derek," Cale said, his tone quieter but no less commanding, "prepare a final strike. Focus all remaining firepower on their core. This ends now." Derek hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding. "Understood, strategist. Preparing final volley." The fleet shifted once more, their movements precise despite the chaos. The final volley launched, a concentrated barrage that tore through the void with blinding intensity. The Aegis reeled under the impact, its distortions collapsing as the core glowed with an unstable brilliance. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent, the void holding its breath. Then, the Aegis responded. A pulse of energy erupted from the human ship, a gravitational wave so powerful it bent the light around it. The fleet was thrown into disarray, their formations shattered as the wave tore through their ranks. Ships fractured, their crystalline hulls splintering into the void like dying stars. Kyle gripped the edge of his console, his claws digging into the surface. The Aegis remained, its dark form defiant even in its apparent vulnerability. And as Cale stared into the abyss of its unyielding presence, he realized the battle was far from over. Cale Varick braced himself against the edge of the command console, his towering crystalline frame reflecting fractured beams of light from the shattered tactical display. The TNS Aegis loomed in the void, its cobalt veins now pulsing with erratic brilliance, like a wounded predator refusing to fall. The Therax fleet was in disarray, its once cohesive formations splintered, reduced to fractured shards drifting amid the wreckage of their finest vessels. The bridge of the Viralock was a battlefield of its own. Officers moved with grim determination, their claws darting over controls, issuing commands that felt more like desperate prayers than calculated strategies. The air thrummed with tension, a pressure that seemed to emanate from the Aegis itself, a final, silent challenge. "Strategist," Derek said, his voice hoarse, as though the words were dragged from his chest. "The fleet is barely holding. If we sustain another wave like that, there won't be enough left to regroup." Cale's secondary heart thudded steadily, his focus unwavering despite the chaos around him. His eyes locked onto the projection of the Aegis, its distorted silhouette flickering like a ghost. It was damaged, yes, but it was still dangerous. He could feel it, a presence that refused to be extinguished. "This is no longer about the fleet," Kyle said, his voice low but cutting. "This is about understanding why they fight, why they survive." Derek hesitated, his mandibles clicking softly. "Understanding, strategist? They've decimated us. What more is there to understand?" Cale turned his sharp gaze toward his tactician. Their defiance, their ingenuity. They're not simply fighting for survival. They're reshaping the rules of the battlefield. This is not war as we know it. This is a lesson. A static-laced transmission flickered onto the main display. the image crackling before resolving into the face of Captain Adrian Voss. His uniform was frayed, his expression worn, but his eyes carried the same piercing intensity that had haunted Cale since their first encounter. "High Strategist Cale Varick," Voss began, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into his features. "You've pushed us further than we anticipated. Your fleet's tenacity is remarkable, but this conflict is over." Cale's mandibles tightened, his crystalline frame radiating defiance. "You speak as though you've already won, Captain. But your ship is damaged. Your systems are faltering. The Aegis is as vulnerable as we are." Voss's lips curved into a faint smile, a shadow of humor in his otherwise somber demeanor. "You're right. We're not invincible. But what matters isn't whether the Aegis survives, it's what it represents. You've seen it, haven't you? The idea it carries." Cale's secondary heart pounded louder, his thoughts racing. "An idea," he echoed, his voice sharper now. "You've sacrificed your fleet for an abstraction?" Voss's smile faded, replaced by a gravity that felt like the weight of a collapsing star. "Not an abstraction. A truth. That survival isn't about dominance or brute strength. It's about adaptation. Resilience. Humanity learned that the hard way, strategist. And now, so will you." Kyle stepped closer to the display, his crystalline features illuminated by the faint glow of the transmission. "What are you offering, Captain? A truce? An alliance?" Voss's gaze didn't waver. "Neither. I'm offering you a choice. Retreat now, and we'll share what we've learned, the advancements, the possibilities. But if you insist on continuing this fight, know this: humanity doesn't fight for conquest. We fight because we've been forged in struggle, in the knowledge that the galaxy will not spare the weak." The channel went silent, the weight of Voss's words settling over the bridge like ash after a fire. Cale turned to his officers, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. The TNS Aegis still floated in the void, its pulsing veins casting faint shadows across the battlefield. Derek broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "Strategist, their ship is holding position. They're not moving to attack." Cale stared at the projection, his thoughts a storm of calculation and doubt. The Therax Dominion had ruled through strength, through dominance, for thousands of cycles. Yet here, in the face of a single human ship, that doctrine felt hollow. "What are your orders, strategist?" Derek asked, his mandibles tight with tension. Cale's claws tapped against the edge of the console, a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Order the fleet to stand down. Maintain defensive positions. If they move, we retaliate." Derek hesitated, his eyes widening slightly. "You're not continuing the assault?" Cale's gaze remained fixed on the Aegis, its damaged hull a testament to both its fragility and its defiance. "No, tactician, not yet." The bridge fell into an uneasy silence as the fleet complied, their weapons powering down. The Aegis didn't move, its cobalt veins dimming to a faint, steady glow. It was as though the ship itself were waiting, watching. "Open the channel," Kyle said, his voice softer now but no less commanding. Varn obeyed, his claws trembling faintly as he patched the connection. The holographic display flickered again, revealing Voss's face. The human captain said nothing, his expression unreadable as he waited for Cale to speak. "You've made your point," Cale said, his tone colder now, laced with the barest edge of respect. "But understand this, Captain. The Therax Dominion does not yield. If you're offering knowledge, it will be on our terms." Voss inclined his head slightly, a faint glimmer of acknowledgement in his gaze. "I wouldn't expect anything less, strategist. But know this, if our paths cross again, it won't be with a single ship." The channel closed, the transmission fading into silence. Kyle turned back to the tactical display, his thoughts heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The Aegis began to drift, its cobalt veins fading into the darkness as it moved away from the battlefield. The bridge remained silent, the officers exchanging wary glances as they awaited Cale's next command. Finally he spoke, his voice low but resolute. "Send word to the Imperial Command," Kale said, his mandibles tightening. "Inform them we've encountered a force unlike any other. And tell them this: the galaxy has changed. We must change with it." The officers moved to comply, their claws tapping over controls with renewed purpose. Kyle stared into the void, the faint glimmer of the Aegis growing dimmer until it disappeared entirely. For the first time in his long career, he felt the weight of uncertainty, of a galaxy no longer bound by the rules he had once mastered. And yet, as he turned away from the viewport, a faint flicker of something else stirred within him. Not defeat, not fear, but the faintest glimmer of understanding. The age of Therax dominance had ended. The age of humanity had begun.